Hello! Today I'm taking another look at a bit of Final Fantasy VIII lore with reflections on that often forgotten, and for many outright ignored, onboarding device of the Balamb Garden Network. Now, you may recall that our only necessary interaction with this feature is right at the beginning of the game, where after morning registration with Quistis, Squall needs to use the computer to, for some unfathomable and unexplained reason, download the Guardian Forces, Quetzalcoatl and Shiva, so that he can junction them. But where some players, including myself back in the day, might have opted to ignore the other content that was on the platform and never really return to it again, what we in fact find, if we choose to explore this network, and indeed return to the network as the game goes on, right up until towards the end of the game, is a wealth of lore, story, characterization and context about the world that we are operating in. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that we are all idiots for ignoring this marvellous fountain of knowledge, because the Garden Network isn't exactly engaging, and I think the biggest detractor to the Garden Network is how clumsily designed it is, because once you click through these categories, you find that it's basically just comprised of dialogue box after dialogue box. It's not the best player experience or the most visually appealing experience, but nonetheless there were some great facts and factoids in there, and as I say, it gets better as the game proceeds, and we are going to break those down and explore the Balamb Network in its entirety here. Now, the Balamb Garden Network is broken down into 6 categories, within which they have their own subcategories, many of them, and upon our first interaction, the system will automatically download or license or whatever the Guardian Forces to Squall, and then we are free to explore it. So, right off the bat, what I always appreciated about the Garden computer was how it sought to bridge game mechanics and this player-facing stuff and player onboarding with the lore, with the story, and with the narrative onboarding of the in-game world. And even at this early point in the first 10 minutes of the game, you can get a bunch of information about magic, about sorceresses, about locations in the world, if you go looking for it. So, working through to summarise each of these categories, we first have the tutorial, and the tutorial is basically the same tutorial menu that's available to Squall when we press triangle or circle, I can't remember which it is, and we get the character menu come up, and we have the tutorial screen there. And what this does is it basically breaks down the more mechanical, player-facing sorts of information required for the battle system, for example, and stuff like that. And actually, something I always admired about the tutorial menu is, again, how it is a living, breathing feature within the game, because as you continue through the story, it will give you little summaries of characters that you meet and places that you visit, and it was really reflective, I think, of one of Seed's core goals that Headmaster Sid mentions, which is that he wants his students to... So there's plenty of bits of lore tucked away in Final Fantasy VIII's austere menu screens that are really quite unique, with the battle meter, which shows you your character's win, loss and KO ratios in battle, being another favourite of mine too, which we pick up from Headmaster Sid if we choose to. Below the tutorials category, we have what's called the basics. Now, as someone who works in experience design, the basics is not a brilliant category title when it sits next to a category called tutorial, because for many people, these are kind of interchangeable, similar terms, and thus it's quite hard to really know what information we're going to see within either of these sections, and it might detract us from even bothering to look. But what the basics seeks to do is, rather than being a player-facing tutorial about gameplay mechanics and battle systems and so on, is it intends to embed us within the lore and the setting of Final Fantasy VIII, specifically the hows and the whys of magic, or paramagic in this case, Guardian Forces and sorceresses and this sort of thing, and why they work the way they do. And for those that are attentive to this and willingly explored this at the beginning of the game, you actually get a heck of a lot more context and understanding around events that come later, such as why junctioning exists, who Dr. Odin is, and stuff like that. And it's quite funny to me, because by today's standards, the basics section of Final Fantasy VIII is virtually nothing to read. It's about 5 panels of dialogue, and yet, speaking for myself back in the day, and for many others, it just felt like quite a labour to sit through and read this stuff, and many people just ignored it altogether. So later, when the sorceress appears and murders Deling and stuff like that, we were just like, who's this? What's happening? Whereas the more inquisitive players were certainly rewarded here. But what I will say, and despite being a huge fan of Final Fantasy VIII, is something I've commented on in the past as well, actually, is the rather janky onboarding in the early game. And while it is a very narratively cohesive game, the Quistis segments where she's unloading all these junction tutorials on us, and this section, the basics of the tutorial, which is an optional way to be eased into the world, they are among the more clumsy bits of information transfer, in my opinion. And as a comparative example of how to do this well, by showing and not telling, we have the example of the Nibelheim flashback in Final Fantasy VII, where we briefly enter a materia cave and witness not only a conversation with Sephiroth, who alludes to his origins and that part of the story, but we also learn a lot more about the nature and the formation of materia. We learn a lot about how it creates Soldier First Class, and it's simply a really interesting scenario that in about a minute of conversation downloads a whole bunch of information and lore to us as players in an engaging way. Moving beyond the basics section, we have the About Garden section, and this is huge context for what Balamb Garden actually is and does, and something I didn't mention in my original review of the game, or actually in any subsequent conversations I've had around Final Fantasy VIII, of which there are many, but many people have actually suggested this to me since, is how Final Fantasy VIII leans into this high school experience theme quite heavily. And I think I didn't appreciate it at the time when I first played the game, because I was also at school, so it seemed kind of normal to me. While today, looking back at it, and as I play it now as an adult, it's much clearer and it's much more obvious to gauge, for example, the emotional level of the characters and stuff like that. And also the setting, which, like a lot of 90s teen movies, makes me nostalgic for the American high school experience I never had, or in this case I suppose Japanese. And even looking at the cadet uniforms during the Dollet mission, for example, we have Selphie and Squall and these guys dressed up. They don't look a million miles away from the high school uniforms we see in Japan. So there is a lot of this high school vibe if we're attentive to it and we're actually looking. And the About Garden section of the Balamb Network really just doubles down and emphasises on this setting by breaking down the rules and etiquette in the classroom, student amenities. There's actually quite a lot of info in here, which isn't super important or necessary, but again it just embellishes this sense of it being a high school. And a lot of it actually I don't even remember reading, and there's a few choice examples here under the rules section where it states, any violent or sexually promiscuous behaviour will result in expulsion. And also under the rules it reads, think very carefully before starting a relationship. And I thought this was kind of weird and quite heavy, but apparently Japanese schools are really against dating and they don't really allow it, which I find interesting, and I suppose helps contextualise why these garden rules might exist, because obviously it's a Japanese game. But more specifically to the game lore, there is a section about Galbadia Garden, and I really liked this because it states that Headmaster Martine has set up a program for students, including Balamb graduates, to enter the Galbadian army once they leave. And I find this interesting because it hints quite early on about Galbadia's militarization, and it kind of alludes, reading between the lines, about whether Martine is either wantonly or inadvertently complicit through this dubious conscription service. So, while we only see Martine, I think literally twice in the game, we see him during the briefing for Adia's assassination mission, and we see him at Fisherman's Horizon, where he's been dismissed from Garden. I think it adds an extra subtlety here that was actually quite cool. The next category is a message from Garden. Again, not the best label, but this includes some school-specific information, such as comical cafeteria updates about the violent demands for hot dogs. There's some informative bits about school calendars and stuff like that. So it's vaguely interesting for the context of it kind of being a high school, if nothing else. And next we have the category which is Garden Square, which actually I found quite amusing, and I think it had a bit more potential than what was actually delivered, but it was a really good idea. Now, the UI isn't brilliant here, which is the main letdown, because it's basically just using the dialogue boxes. But the Garden Square is intended to be a classic 1990s style chat forum, with people using pseudonyms, in this case their initials, to complain and argue among one another. There's a rather thinly veiled message from Zell about hot dogs appearing, there's a menacing message from Cypher appearing, and actually the first inkling of the Zell librarian romantic sidequest appears here because she wishes him luck in his seed exam. So it's quite a succinct section. I think if they ever remade Final Fantasy VIII, which apparently will be the day that pigs fly, this forum aspect could be quite an amusing update and living, breathing, updating feature that goes alongside Garden. You know, these days probably like a remote thing we could access as well as technology moves forward. I really liked it, and actually I suppose the wider Balamb network could be much more of a thing in terms of both lore and mechanics in the case of a remake, which I would argue, you know, they'd probably have mobile devices and whatever. But while Final Fantasy VIII was strangely perceptive with how it saw digital communication and social media emerging, because again, this is way before Facebook and anything like that. We had the forum, we had the blog, with Selphie being a blogger, and I mean her name is Selphie after all. I do think it, despite being quite prescient, reflects this rudimentary 1990s form of communication and early social media, which really was prevalent at the time in big public chat rooms. Which, yes, obviously, I think they were better, aside from all the Trojans and Predators that you got on AOL chat rooms, but it would almost certainly need updating if Final Fantasy VIII ever got remade, to keep this futuristic-looking game futuristic in the future, if that makes sense. Finally, we have the probably most important and dynamic of the categories in the Balamb network, which is the Garden Festival Committee, which actually is a living, breathing, expanding feature of the network, and one of my favourite curios in the whole of Final Fantasy VIII. So, when we first start the game and use the network, the Garden Festival Committee page has a rather melancholic message from a student called Wimbly Donna, who is failing their exams and is just about to leave Garden. And I really think a missed trick by Square here is not having Wimbly Donna as an NPC in Fisherman's Horizon, having embraced a beatnik lifestyle after dropping out. But as we acquire Selphie in the party, and upon speaking to Selphie at the Seed graduation, in fact, she mentions, so it's kind of tied into canonical lore, she mentions that she's taking on the Garden Festival role. From this point on, as the game progresses, Selphie turns this section of the Balamb network into her own personal blog site. So, first up, in the section later in the game, we have the Friends section, in which we have Rinoa, Irvine, Zell and Quistis giving some thoughts at Selphie's request about themselves. So, as you might imagine, this revolves around hot dogs for Zell, it revolves around girls for Irvine, and so on. There is a diary section, in which we get a Selphie perspective on the story events so far, covering the most pivotal moments of the game, such as visiting SR, being launched into space, the GF amnesia, some of those bits, and actually quite a touching reflection where she wishes a farewell to the disciplinary committee, specifically Reijin and Fujin, which I think taps into a lot of players' feelings about these guys, which is that they aren't actually antagonists, they are schoolmates and comrades that have put their love of Cypher above everything else. So I really like that that's acknowledged in this discreet little corner of the game. And again, the only downsides to these sections really is the distinct lack of dedicated styling or pagination, or just some design work to make them a bit more interesting rather than simply dialogue boxes. And very finally, we have Sir Laguna's page, which, to its credit, it does get some dedicated visuals within Selphie's funky website, and this section is the fruits of a side quest that we can undertake in the game, which is finding the Timber Maniacs magazines. And back when I was first playing Final Fantasy VIII, I didn't really get what those magazines did. I didn't understand. I'd occasionally find them, and it was only much later when I bought the piggyback edition of the Final Fantasy VIII strategy guide. I was reading through that, and I learned that each Timber Maniacs magazine adds a chapter to Sir Laguna's adventures in Selphie's blog. And actually, I recently did an episode about amazing details in Final Fantasy VIII, and I probably could have added this Timber Maniacs quest too, because yet another subtlety of Laguna's story, aside from being Squall's dad and that stuff, is how through finding the Timber Maniacs magazines, we discover that he does fulfill his dream of becoming a journalist, which he mentions to Julia in the very first dream sequence. And if we recall later in Windhill, which I think is maybe the third dream, Kiros mentions to him that a magazine editor is looking for writers, which sparks this episode in Laguna's life that we never actually witness firsthand. But I think it's fantastic because reading between the lines, such is the subtlety of this game and this side quest that the Balamb Network computer fulfills, it shows us how Laguna's life kind of went, and he did fulfill this dream and stuff like that. So I love this Timber Maniacs side quest, I love the subtlety of the story here, and as I say, specifically the Laguna page on Selphie's blog. If you're into the lore and story, above all else, the Timber Maniacs side quest is reward unto itself, I think. So there we have it, a brief little look at the Balamb Network, which is loved, loathed, but largely ignored, I think, in the grand scheme of things in Final Fantasy VIII. But it's a fantastic source of lore and story, and as I say, if this game is ever approached for a remake, this section is ripe for potential to be expanded upon, as I say, as a remote feature, as a forum, library, whatever, and I would hope that they retain that sort of Laguna side quest or something along those lines, although we'd probably expect them to expand Laguna's story in the game, since originally it was supposed to be like half of the game. But there we have it, that's the Balamb Network explored. If you got this far, thanks very much for listening, and drop a comment, let me know your thoughts on the Balamb Network's role in Final Fantasy VIII.